Okay, so today we're going to make a really simple cryptocurrency portfolio calculator using React and Ruby on Rails. So before we get started, let's take a quick look at what we're going to be making. So on the left, we have a search bar where we can look for different cryptocurrencies. And then on the right, we have our portfolio, which is empty right now. So we're going to do a couple cool things here. We're going to do like a sort of autocomplete search. So let's say I want to add Bitcoin to my portfolio. You can see all of the related options to my search will show up over here with their name and their symbol. So let's say that I want to add Bitcoin to my portfolio. I'll then be prompted with how much do I own. So let's say that I owned 15 Bitcoin. I can then click on calculate my total. And what that'll do is that'll add that over on the right into our portfolio. So you can see now we have Bitcoin added to our portfolio. We can see what the current price is at this time. We can see the amount that we own, and then we can see the actual current value of that asset for our portfolio based off the amount we currently own and the current price of Bitcoin. And then you can see up here we have our total portfolio value. So that'll change as we add additional assets into the portfolio. So let's go back over here and we can look for Ethereum, and let's say that we own, like 45 of that. I can then again click calculate my total. That will add Ethereum to the portfolio. And now on top of seeing the current price of Ethereum and the value based off how much I own, we can see that the total portfolio value has updated based off all of the assets in the portfolio. So additionally, I can go over here and I can look for, let's say, Litecoin, and I can say I have 100 of that, calculate my total. And yeah, you get the idea. We'll come in here, we'll throw in some stellar lumens. We'll say I have 1,000 of that or 10,000 of that. Calculate. So you can see now we have this list of all the different assets in our portfolio. We've got the current price of those assets, the amount we own. We've got the current value of that individual cryptocurrency. And then up here we have the total portfolio value of all of the different cryptocurrency assets that we have in our portfolio. Okay, so first things first, I'm going to go ahead and create a new Rails app. So over here in my terminal, I'm going to do Rails new, and then I'm just going to call this Crypto Calculator. And then we want to do a couple additional things. So I want to set my database to Postgres. So I'm going to do -d equals PostgreSQL. And then the other thing that we want to do here is we want to basically set Webpack and set it to React. So what we can do is we can do --Webpack. And we can do equals React. And what that'll do is that'll basically set us up with the Webpacker gem and configure it so that we can use React within our Rails app. So let's go ahead and run that. All right, so now we've created our new Rails app. And if you look here, you can see we've set it up with Webpacker and we've set it up to use React. So the next thing that I'm going to do now is I'm just going to cd into our new app, and then I'm just going to run Rails db create to create our new database. All right, so the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new model in our app and call it currency. And basically what we'll do is create a new database table that we can use to add all of the seed data for our different cryptocurrencies. So that when we get into the React portion, we can use that data to make various API requests to get the real-time prices and do our calculations. So I'm going to use a Rails generator to create a new model. So in my terminal, I'm going to do Rails G model, and G is just shorthand for generate. So we're saying Rails generate a new model. We're going to call it currency. And then we can add all of the fields that we want to add to our currency table in the database. Okay, so now for each currency that we add, we're going to want to have a name, which is going to be a string. We might want to have a description, so we'll just add that just in case. We might want to use their max supply, so we'll add that. I'm going to set that to a type of big int because that can be like a really big number, like in the millions. And then we're going to want to have a currency symbol. So if you think for Bitcoin, that's BTC. For Ethereum, it's ETH. So we'll have the currency symbol, and that'll be a string. And then additionally, I want to add a slug to each cryptocurrency, and we'll see that'll come in handy in a little bit here. Okay, so I think that that's everything that we need for our currency model. So let's go ahead and hit enter and create that. Cool. So we can see that that created a migration and added a new model called currency in our app. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to open up this project in Atom really quick, just so we can take a look at what we just changed. Sorry, let me get this out of the way. So if we look over here, we can see a pretty basic kind of Rails skeleton structure. So we jump into app. Basically what we just did is inside of our models folder, we just created this new currency model. And if we look inside of our DB folder, we can see that inside of our migrate folder, we just created a new migration, and we can see all of the fields that we just added from the terminal being added to create this new currencies table. So we have our name with a type of string, we have our description with a type of string, we have max supply with a type of big int, and then currency symbol and slug, which are both also types of string. So that all looks good. So what we can do now is back in our terminal, we can just go ahead and migrate those changes. So we can do rake db migrate, and we can run that. Cool. So now we can see that we just created our currencies table in our database. So now that we've run that, if we jump over and look into our schema file, we can see now we have our currencies table. So the next thing that I want to do with this is I basically created just a massive seed file with like 1,200 different cryptocurrencies with data that we can use to populate our database. So I'm just going to add that into my seed file here, and then we can run rake db seed or rails db seed to basically seed our database with all of the currencies that we want to use in this portfolio calculator. Okay, so now over in our seed file, I'm just going to go ahead and paste in my seed data. And basically what we have here is just a big list of about 1,200 different cryptocurrencies. So you can see for each one we have the name, the max supply, the currency symbol, and the slug that we want to use. And you know what? I'm actually realizing that I made a mistake a second ago, because if you look back at our schema, I forgot to use an underscore in max supply. So there's two things that I can do here to fix this. I can just change the name of that column in this seed file before we run this, or I can just change the name of the column on our database. And I think for me, I actually just want to really quickly change the name of that column. So what I'm going to do is just really quickly roll back the migration and then change that column name. So what we can do is do rails db rollback, and that'll just roll back our migration. And now what I can do is I can jump back in our migration and I can just change that to fix that problem. And we can jump back over here and we can just do rails db migrate again. Cool, so that's migrated. And now if we check our schema again, the name of that should now match what I've set up in my seed file. So now with that set up, what we can do is we can just jump back into our terminal and we can just do rails db seed to seed our database with this data. All right, so now our database has been seeded. So what we can do now is we can jump into our console with Rails C, and we can just look at that data really quickly in our database. So if we look at currency, if we count, we can see that we have about 1,300 different cryptocurrencies now in our database. And now if we, for example, look at the first item in our database, we can see that we have Bitcoin, and we have the name, we have the max supply, we have the currency symbol, and we have our slug. Similarly, we can look at the last item in our database, and we can see we have some obscure altcoin called GameLink coin. Cool, so now we have a bunch of data in our database. So we can go ahead and exit out of this. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a currencies controller that we can add some logic to. And then we're also going to add a little bit of logic to our currency model that we've already created. But before we do that, really quickly, I just want to add a gem into our gem file that we're going to use for this project. So if we jump over into our gem file, so in a second here, we're going to start using a gem called HTT party. And that's going to help us basically with making API requests from our currency model. So I'm going to go ahead and just add that gem here. So what we can do is we can do gem HTT party and save that. And then over in my terminal, I'm just going to run bundle install to install our new gem. Okay, so now with that set up, let's go ahead and create a currencies controller in our app. And we could use another generator for this and do this from our terminal, but it's going to create like a bunch of extra stuff that we don't really need. So let's just actually go ahead and create that manually. So if we open up our controllers folder, we can see we have our application controller, and basically what we can do is we can just add a new file to that and call this our currencies controller.rb. And then let's just do class currencies controller inherits from application controller. Okay, so now inside of our currencies controller, let's actually create a couple things. So I'm going to create something called index, and I'm going to make that basically the root path of our app in a second. But then I also want to have search and something that I'm going to call calculate. And basically from the React portion of our app, we'll be able to make post requests to these endpoints when we start to build that part out. So let's jump into our routes file, and let's actually add routes for these. So we open up routes.rb. Okay, so now inside of our routes, I want to create a root path and set that to currencies index. And then I also want to create a path for post requests to search, and we're going to set that to currencies search. And then similarly for post requests to calculate, we're going to set that to currencies calculate. And so now if we jump back into our terminal, what we can do is we can do rake routes, and that should show us the routes that we've just set up. We can see now our root path is going to currencies index. We can see that post requests to search are going to currencies search, and we can see that post requests to calculate are going to currencies calculate. Okay, so now with that set up, I'm going to jump into our views folder for a second, and I'm going to create a new currencies folder. And within that, I'm going to create an index.html.erb file. And what we can actually do now is set up our root path. And basically what we want to do is set this up to be the entry point of our React code into our Rails app. So what we can do for this is we can jump up into our JavaScript folder here. And if you look in here, we have this packs folder. And inside of that, we have an application.js file, and we have a hello React file. So basically, if you look in either of these files, you'll see an example of the JavaScript pack tag. And basically what we want to do is we want to copy that, and we just want to put that into our root path here. And that'll basically create the entry point to inject our React into our Rails app. Okay, so now we've set up our root path, and we've added in our JavaScript pack tag. So actually now if we jump into our terminal, we should be able to fire up our server and see this in our browser. So if we go into our browser and we go to localhost 3000, what we should see now is we should see that hello React message from our JavaScript getting rendered into our root path. And we can see that there. So everything's working, and now we have our React rendering into our Rails app. Okay, so before we jump into starting to build out our React components, there's a couple things that I still want to do in our currency model and inside of our currencies controller. So let's jump over into our models folder. And I'm just going to open up that currency model. So the first thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a method, and I'm just going to call this current price. And all that this is going to do is this is going to get the current price of a cryptocurrency for us. So this is where we're actually going to bring in that gem that we added, HTTP party, and we're going to use that to make requests to a third-party API to get back data on various cryptocurrencies. So the API that I'm going to use for this is just the CoinMarketCap API. It's a pretty simple, straightforward API. And the URL for that is api.coinmarketcap /v1/ticker. So that's the base URL that we're going to use. And then what we can do now with this is we can use HTTP party. And what we can do is HTTP party.get. And then inside of that, we can pass in the URL, and we can append on the slug of a currency. So if you remember, we added slugs to the database. So every currency in our database has its own unique slug. And those slugs are actually going to correspond to the endpoint on the CoinMarketCap API, so that we can basically get data on each different cryptocurrency. So let's actually create a variable called request and set that to that. So now what we can do is, let's say response equals JSON.parse, we'll do request.body. So basically we'll get the response from our request, and then we want to get the body of that and parse it into JSON. So now with that, we can actually jump back over into our terminal, and let's just jump into our console. And now we can just test that out. So basically, I'm going to say currency equals, and we'll just grab our first currency, which should be Bitcoin. And now what we can do is we can do currency dot current price. And we can see we get a response back from the API. So we can see we get a bunch of data. So we have the ID, Bitcoin, name Bitcoin, we have the symbol, we have its rank, we have price USD. So we want to grab price USD out of that. So if we say response equals that, then what we want to do is basically get the first item of the array. And then from that, we want to get price USD. So that is what we need to do to get the actual current price of the currency. So basically we can just do that if we want. And that's kind of all the logic that we need to get the real-time price of a given cryptocurrency. So let's jump back over here again, and let's just exit out of that, and then let's try that again. And now if everything works, instead of getting that additional data, we should just get back the price. So let's do currency dot current price. And we can see now, just like that, we can grab the current real-time price of any of the cryptocurrencies in our database. Okay, so now we have a way to get the current price for any of the cryptocurrencies in our database. So the only other thing that we want to really add in here is I want to create a method that basically lets us calculate the value for when somebody is adding a portfolio item to their portfolio. So basically what's going to happen in this scenario is somebody's going to say, I have, let's say Bitcoin, and they're going to say I have a certain amount of it, right? I have 1 Bitcoin, I have 100. So we want to pass in an argument of amount. And then all that we have to do is basically take the current price, which we are now able to get, and we'll convert that to a float. And we just want to multiply that against the amount that the user owns. And we'll make that a float as well. And then I'm just going to wrap this in parentheses and round it to, let's say, 4 decimal points. So let's try that out. Let's jump back over in here. And I'm going to open up my Rails console again. So now let's say currency equals our first currency, which should be Bitcoin. So now let's say that I own 4 Bitcoin. So let's do currency dot calculate value, and we'll pass in 4. And now we can see we're getting back a value of 20,434. And if we look at currency dot current price, we can see the current price is about 5,100. Let's just double check our math just to be safe. So if we do that times 4, we can see we basically get back that number. It's a little bit different because we rounded it in our method, but it looks like that's all working. So now we have a way to get the current price, and we also have a way to basically calculate the value based off the amount somebody owns of a cryptocurrency. So that's basically all of the logic that we need for our currency model. So I think the last thing that I want to do on the Rails side before we jump into our React portion is we just need to add a little bit of logic into our Currencies Controller. So let's just jump over into our Currencies Controller. And basically in here we have this search method. So basically what's going to happen with this is when a user is searching for cryptocurrencies to add to their portfolio, that's going to make a post request to this method basically. So what we want to do here is create just a really simple way to take in that search result and spit back JSON with all of the related cryptocurrencies to that search. So what I'm going to do is let's just create an instance variable, and I'm going to call that currencies. We'll say that equals currency.where. And then what we want to do in here is I'm going to say lower name is like question mark. And then what we want to do is just add like a wildcard search basically. So what we can do is add %, and then inside of that we can do params search, and then I want to actually downcase that. So we'll be comparing the lowercase version of whatever search someone sends through to the lowercase version of the names for currencies in our database. And then let's just render the results for that. So we can do render JSON, and then we can say currencies, and set that equal to currencies. So basically we'll search for the user search results, and then we'll send back JSON with all of the currencies that relate to that user's search. Okay, so now the last thing that I want to do is we need to set up the logic for our calculate method. And so basically what's going to happen here is on the front end in our React app in a second, we're going to create a form so that when a user wants to add a new portfolio item, they'll submit the currency and the amount that they own. And this method will basically take that in and send back the response of kind of all the final calculations based off those methods that we just added in our currency model. So let's just add a little comment for ourselves so we know what's happening here. We'll basically just say takes in the currency ID and the amount owned, returns final calculations, I guess. And this will just be a helpful little reminder so that we know what we need to build in a minute in our React app. So inside of calculate, we're going to do a couple of things. So we know that we're going to get the ID of the currency. So what we can do is say currency equals currency.find and pass in params ID. And what we can actually do with this if we want is we can take that out of our calculate method and we can just create a private method called currency. And this will just free up a little bit of space inside of our calculate method. So back in calculate now, what we need to do is let's set the amount. So we'll say amount equals params amount. And this is going to be the amount of a currency that somebody owns. So now we have the amount and we have the currency. And that's kind of everything that we need to render back the final response. So we can do render JSON. And then inside of here, we want to pass back a couple of things. So in our response, we're going to set the currency. And we're going to set that equal to currency. We want to pass back the current price. And now we have that current price method. So what we can do is say currency.currentPrice. And then we also want to pass back the amount. So we can say amount. And then finally, we want to pass back the value, which is going to use that method that we created in our model to calculate the value. So we can do currency.calculateValue. And then our calculate value method is going to take a single argument, which is amount. And I think that that is all that we need to pass back in the JSON for our calculate method. So I think that that is everything that we need to do on the Rails side. So with that, I think we're ready to jump into building out our React components. Cool, so now we are ready to jump into our JavaScript folder. So the first thing that I want to do is let's turn our server back on. So I'm going to do Rails S. And then what we can actually do if we want is we can also do bin/webpack dev server. And then this will basically turn on that sort of real-time reloading. So now we have our server running. So if we jump back over into our browser, if I refresh that, looks like everything's cool. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over into our JavaScript folder. And I'm actually going to create a new components folder. And this is where we'll put all of our new components for our app. So actually, the first thing I'm going to do is let's create a new file, and I'm just going to call that app.js. And then in here, we'll create our first component.
So in here, let's go ahead and do import React. And I'm going to import component from React. And then let's go ahead and just create a simple app component. So we'll do class app extends component. And we'll do render. And we'll do return. And then let's just do like a simple div for now. And then we can do our own just little hello world.
So now down here, let's go ahead and export that. So I'm going to do export default app. And then what we can do is back over in our hello React file, I'm going to actually rename that index.js. And then let's get rid of a bunch of this. And let's go ahead and just pass in our app component. And I'm just going to import that up here. So we'll do import app from components/app. And then we just need to do one thing because I changed the name of this from hello React to index. So we actually, in our root path, which is our currencies index file, we need to just change this to be index as well. And because we renamed that file, we might need to restart our server. So let's just do that really quick. So we'll do Rails S, and then we'll do bin/webpack dev server. So now if we open up our browser, it looks like we now have our new hello world message that's coming from our app component. So that's cool. So now we have our components folder, we have our own component, we've gotten rid of their kind of default that they gave us. And now we're starting to play with our own logic. So now back in our components folder, let's go ahead and create another component and I'm just going to call this portfolio container .js.
So let's go ahead and again we'll import React and components from React. And then let's create a new component, and we'll say class portfolio container extends component.
So now inside of our portfolio container, let's actually create a constructor method. And that's going to take in props. And then in here, we're going to do super props. And let's actually set state in here. We might move this around, but let's just for now, let's set up our state right here. So I'm going to do this.state. And there's a couple of things that I want to set up here. So we're going to set name, and we'll just default that to an empty string. I'm going to say portfolio. And for now, I think I'm just going to make that an empty array. We'll do, let's say search or search results maybe. And we'll make that an empty array as well. And then I'm going to have basically when the user selects a currency from a list of their search results, we want to make that the active currency for when they then submit the calculation to add it to their portfolio. So let's just call this active currency. So let's just do, I guess, null for that for now. And then finally, we want to set a value for amount. And this will be the amount that the user owns of that currency. And we can make this null or like an empty string, I guess. We'll see how that works out. Okay, so now within our portfolio container, I think there's going to be like three main things that we're going to want to include in here. So if you think about kind of what we're trying to build, there's going to be a search component, which is basically just going to be a search field that the user can use to search for a cryptocurrency. And that's going to basically just make a post request to that search endpoint we created on the Rails side. And then we'll also have a calculate component that does kind of the same thing for calculate. And then finally, we want to actually have the portfolio itself. So there's kind of three main components that I think we want to bring into this. So let's actually create some new files in our components folder.
So I'm going to create a search file, and we'll create calculate, and then we will create portfolio.
And then let's start with search.
So the first thing I'm going to do here is again, let's just import React and components from React. And then let's create a new component for search. So we class search extends component. And then we'll include a constructor here, and we'll pass in props, and then we'll do super props. Let's do render.
And then for now, let's just create a div, and we'll say search goes here. And then let's just basically do the exact same thing for calculate.
So let's paste this in here, and we'll swap in calculate for class. And then we'll just say calculate logic goes here.
And then, we need to export default calculate, and we need to export search. So now let's jump back over into our portfolio container, and in here let's import our new search and calculate components, and then let's actually render, and then we'll return, and in here we'll do search and calculate. So we'll return our search and calculate components inside of our portfolio container, and we need to just wrap that in a div so we don't have two top level components in here. So let's just wrap that like that, and then let's do export default portfolio container, and then in our app now we can do import portfolio container from portfolio container. And then instead of this hello world, let's just actually pass in our portfolio container component. So let's see what that looks like now in our browser. Oh, you know what? Sorry. We need to do that. Cool. So now we have our search component and our calculate component rendering inside of our portfolio container, which is getting pulled into our app and getting rendered out into the page. Okay, so now we have our search component and we have our calculate component. And so basically what's going to happen here is I think what we want to do is create two different forms. So we'll have our search form where the user can search for a cryptocurrency. And that'll basically make a post request to our currencies controller to that search method we set up. And then when a user selects a result from that, we'll set that active currency value in our state. And then we'll take them to the calculate component. And within the calculate component, they'll set the amount and they'll actually add the portfolio item to their portfolio. So the second component is what's going to make the post request to that calculate method within our currencies controller. So let's actually go ahead and just create forms for each of these components now. So if I jump back into Atom, we can go back over into search. Basically, we just want to create a form for this so that a user can search for cryptocurrencies.
So I'm going to get rid of this. And then inside of this div, let's go ahead and create, I'm going to create like an H1 header. So in here, let's just say cryptocurrency portfolio calculator. And then let's go ahead and create our form. So inside our form, I'm going to create another div and just give it a class name of form group. And then inside of here, we'll actually have our label and our input fields. Let's do a label. And in here, we'll just say search for a currency. And then let's do a little line break. And down here, we'll have our input field. So we'll do an input, and we'll say autocomplete is off, and I want to give it a type of text. We'll say name equals name. We'll give it a little placeholder. So we'll say placeholder equals example, Bitcoin, Litecoin, Ethereum, ... And then we want to give it a value, which for now we'll make just empty.
And then let's actually give that a class as well. So I'll just say class name equals field. So now we have our search form, we have a label, and we have an input where a user can search for a cryptocurrency. So let's jump over and just take a look at that in our browser. So we can see now we have our header that we just added, and in our search component we have the label and we have our input field. Okay, so now let's actually set up some events on our search form. So what we actually want to do for value is, let's get rid of that, and we want to make this equal to this.props.name. And then what we want to do is we want to set up an on change in our input field here. We want to set that equal to this.handle change. But actually, I'm going to set this up in our portfolio container and then pass this down in our props to search. So let's actually do this.props.handle change. And then inside of our portfolio container now, we can actually create a handle change method. So in our handle change method, what I want to do is, let's say we're going to pass in an argument of E, and that's going to be the event. And then let's actually just throw in a debugger into that. So what we can do now in our search is we can say handle change equals this.handle change. And then up in our constructor, let's just say this.handle change equals this.handle change dot bind this. So now in our browser, if we open up our console, if I try to type in this now, we should hit our debugger. And we do. So if we jump into the console, we can see that E is a synthetic event. We can see that E.target is the input field that we're changing. And if we do E.target.value, we can see the value that we're actually passing into that input field. So now what we can do with that is, back in our app, we can basically, inside of our handle change method, we can update the state. So we can do this.setState. And what we can do is basically we can set e.target.name and set that equal to e.target.value. And so what this will do is basically anytime something in that input field changes, this is going to modify what the name value is in our state. And we can see that by basically just console logging this.state.name. So let's take a look at that in our browser. So let me refresh this. And now let's say you can see as I'm typing into this, it's modifying what the name value is in our state. So what we can do with that is basically, as this gets modified now, we can make a post request to that search endpoint in the currencies controller to render back search results in real time as the user searches for different cryptocurrencies. So let's actually try this out. So let's set up a post request in our, in our handle change for when that search field is being modified. And we can actually set up a post request to that search endpoint in our Rails controller. So before we do this, I'm going to install a tool called Axios. And that's basically just going to help us make those post requests from our React code to our Rails backend. So over in my terminal, I'm just going to kill this and I'm going to do yarn add Axios. So now with Axios installed, we can actually import that here. So in my portfolio container, I'm going to do import Axios from Axios. What we can do now is we can actually set up a post request so that when we are searching in that search field that we just created, we can actually post to that search endpoint in our app, and we can query the database for all of the cryptocurrencies that are basically a match for that search. So what we can do here is we can do axios.post. And what we're going to do is basically just make a post request to localhost 3000. And if you remember what that endpoint is, it was search. And then basically for the data that we want to pass through, we can just do name and pass in this.state.name. And then we can basically just set up a dot then, and we'll say data, and we'll just throw a debugger in there. And then we can also do a dot catch, and we can just say, again, data, and we'll throw a debugger in there as well. So that's all that we really need to do to make a post request with Axios. However, this is not going to work out of the box. So basically, Rails has built-in CSRF protection. So what's going to happen when we try to run this right now is we're going to get back a bunch of errors most likely. So let's see what happens if we try to do our real-time search now. Before we do this, I'm going to go ahead and just restart my servers really quickly. So we'll do Rails S again, and then we'll do bin webpack dev server. Okay, so let's go ahead and try this. So I'm going to refresh this. So let's see what happens if I try to search in this now. We can see that we end up in our catch. We can see we get an error. So we jump over into our Rails server now. If we scroll up, we can see basically we get a 422 unprocessable entity. And the reason for that is that we have an invalid authenticity token error. So basically Rails has built-in CSRF protection. So what we need to do is modify our React app a little bit in order to get past that. So let's jump over into our code, and I'm actually going to go into my app component. And let's import Axios from Axios here. And now what we can basically do here is we can set our CSRF token in our headers with Axios. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do const CSRF token. I'm going to set that equal to document.querySelector. I'm going to pass in name equals CSRF token, and then we want to get the content from that. So now what we can do with Axios, we can do axios.defaults.headers.common, and we can basically say x CSRF token equals our CSRF token variable that we just set. So now this should basically set our CSRF token in our headers before we try to make our post request with Axios. So let's jump back over into our portfolio container, and let's actually just get rid of this for now. And I'm just going to pass through the value directly from the input field to the value in our post request. And you know, this actually needs to be search because that's what we have it set up as in our controller. So our post request should work now, and if everything works out, then we should end up in our .then, and we should be able to look at the data that we're getting back from our controller. So let's jump over into my browser, and let's see what happens now if we try to search. So entered B, we hit our debugger, we're inside of our then, and we can see that we're getting back some data with a 200 status, which looks like everything worked out. So let's take a look at data now. So if we open that up, we can see that inside of this, we're getting back about 261 currencies. So if we look at this, we can see we're getting back Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Gold. So it looks like our search is working, and we've already narrowed it down from 1,300 items in our database to just 260 results by just searching for the letter B. So that's pretty cool. Let me close this out, and let's actually jump back over into our code. And instead of a debugger, let's just console log data so that it's not stopping us every time we enter a letter into that search field. So we jump back over here now. I'm just going to refresh that. Let's say I look for Bitcoin. Let's see what the last response was here. So we have data. It looks like we got 26 results back for Bitcoin. It looks like we have now Bitcoin, Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin Gold. So it looks like the search is working pretty well. Let's see now if we look for Ethereum. If we check this out, we can see it looks like we end up with 8 results. If we look at those, we have Ethereum Classic. So it looks like the search is actually working pretty well. So what I want to do next is I want to actually display those search results into our page. So let's jump back into our code. And what we can do is, I'm going to get rid of this for now. But what we can do is inside of our .then, we can actually do this .setState. And what we can do instead of this is, if you remember, we have this search results value in our state, and it starts out as an empty array. So what we can do is say search results, and we can set that as an array. But inside of that, what we can do is set data.data.currencies is the value that's getting passed back. And now let's go ahead and let's just console log that to make sure that that's working. So we jump back over here. If I search for Bitcoin, we can see that our search results have 26 items in it, and it looks like that's all working. Cool. So now we're updating our search results. So what we can do is in our search component, we can say search results equals this.state.search results. And then if we go over to our search component now, what we could do is underneath our form field, we can create maybe another div. We'll just give this a class name of, let's say, currencies or currency list. And then inside of this, we can basically put our search results to display onto the page. So to do that, I'm going to jump up here, and before I return, I'm just going to set a new value, and I'm just going to say const search results is equal to, so what we can do is this.props.search results, and then we can do .map, and then we can say cur or currency, and what we want to do is I'm going to create maybe a list item, and we're going to give that a key and set that equal to the current item's ID. And then what we can do is inside of that, we can just pass through the name of the currency. So we'll do cur.name. And if that works, then what we should be able to do down here is basically just do search results and have that render into the page. So let's take a look now. And I'm going to refresh this, and let's see what happens if I search for Bitcoin. Cool. So now we have real-time search results displaying as list items into the page. So similarly, we can look for Ethereum, we can look for Litecoin, Dash, Ripple, whatever you can think of basically. Okay, so let's jump back into the code, and I'm going to modify this a little bit. So inside of each list item, I'm going to give it a class name. And I'm going to set this to, if you remember, the wrapper around this is currency list. So I'm just going to set the class of this to be currency list item. And then inside of this, what I want to do is I'm going to wrap this in an anchor tag. And then I'm going to wrap the currency name with a span. And what we can actually do is we can also pass in and I'm going to wrap this in another span. We can actually pass in the currency symbol. So we can do cur.currency symbol. Because remember, we're getting that back in our data from the database as well. So let's just take a look and make sure that that works. So we go back over here. If I look for Bitcoin, we can see it is an anchor tag now, and we're getting back both the name and the currency symbol for each item. So I just want to make like 1 or 2 more small tweaks to this list. So the first thing I'm going to do is I just want to give this anchor tag a class. So let's just give it a class name of, let's say, currency. And then the last thing I'm going to do, and I'm not sure if I'm going to need this or not, but just in case, I'm going to give this a data ID. And I'm also going to set that equal to the currency ID. So now with that, what I want to do next is I want to actually create a new on-click event on our list items. And I'm just going to pass in, let's just call this handle select. So we're going to create this in our portfolio container, and then we'll pass this down as props. So we'll do this.props.handle select. And then in our portfolio container, let's go ahead and let's create that. And so what I want to do with this is basically, if we look at this list, what I want to do is create an on-click method that is basically going to set that as the active currency. So if we jump back over here, let's pass in E, and then the first thing I want to do in this is basically do e.prevent default. So let's actually just throw a debugger in here. So what we can do now is in our search component, we can do handle select equals this dot handle select. And then similar to our handle change, we need to do this dot handle select equals this dot handle select dot bind this. And then in our search, I think we've already set this up. So we have this dot props dot handle select. So we should be good there. So now when we try to click on one of the list items, we should hit our debugger, and we can look at how we can set the active currency basically. And one thing that I want to do just really quickly, because our search results are starting to get a little ugly, is I want to just bring in a little bit of CSS to style our search results. And now if we jump back over into my browser, and if we search again for Bitcoin, when I select this item, we should hit our debugger. And we do. So if I jump into my console now, what we can do is we can look at e.target, and we can see that list item. So what I can do now is I can do e.target.get attribute, and I think that this is generally frowned upon for getting the ID of an item, but I'm just going to be a little bit lazy. And I'm going to say e.target.get attribute and pass in the data ID, and that'll basically let me get the ID of the element that's been selected. So now that we know that we can get the ID of the selected item, what we can do is we can go back into our handle select, and basically we can update our state now to set the active item when one is selected. So what we can do is we can do const ID equals e.target.get attribute and pass in that data ID, and that'll basically give us back that data ID that we just did in our console in the browser. And then what we can do is say active item or active currency equals let's see. So we want to do I'm going to grab this.state.search results. So that'll be the full list of items that have been returned. And what we want to do is basically just filter that for the one that's been selected. So what we can do is item, and then we can say item.id. So we can check the ID of each of the currencies in the return search results and see if it's equal to the one that's been selected. So we can do item.id equal to ID. And let's actually just make sure that that is an integer and not a string. So we'll do filter, and then we'll check if the item ID is equal to the selected item's ID. So we've got our debugger in there. So let's see what happens now when we hit that debugger. So I'm going to jump back here and we'll refresh this. So let's try that again. So if we look over here now, we should have access to an ID variable and an active currency variable. So let's see what we have. So let's see, ID is equal to 1 and active currency is Bitcoin. So that works. So now we're basically just filtering through the search results and collecting just the one item that we want. And what we can do now is just update our state to set that as the active currency. Okay, so let's jump back into our code. And what we can do now is after we set that, let's go ahead and do this.setState. And what I want to do is we want to set active currency. And we can just grab this variable. And I think that the result is actually an array. So what we want to do is just grab the first item out of that. So we're just returning the actual item and not the array. And then at this point, now that we have an active currency, we can go ahead and we can empty the search results. So we can also say search results and set that back to an empty array. Okay, so now that we're setting the active currency, what we can actually do is, so I don't actually want to show both of these components at the same time. So I think what I want to do is basically have the search result, and then once you select a currency, it switches to the calculate component where you enter in the amount. So what we can actually do is we can check now if we have an active currency, and we can basically decide whether to show our search component or our calculate component. So if we jump over here and just look, we can see that basically this entire time while we've been working on our search component, the calculate component has been here as well. So while we do things, the calculate component is just kind of sitting underneath all of this. So what I actually want to do is I want to hide it. I want to hide it when we're searching, and I want to show it when we've selected an active currency. So what we can do is we can jump back over here, and inside of our portfolio container, in render, we can basically create a new const, and I'm just going to call this like search or calculate. I don't know. So basically what we can do now is just check and see if active currency is null, and if it is null, then we'll show search. If a currency is actively being selected, then we'll switch and show our calculate component. So basically what we can do to check this is we can do this dot state dot active currency, and we can just do a ternary operator. So we can say if there's something there and it's not null, then we want to show our calculate component. Otherwise, we want to show our search component. And let's just make this a little bit easier to read. So we'll drop that down. Okay, so just to recap, we're setting this const search or calculate, and we're basically saying if we have an active currency, then we want to show the calculate form that we're going to make in a second. Otherwise, we want to show the search form. So what we can do now is we can grab that value and we can just pass that in down here instead of this. So just throw that in there. And now let's take a look and see if that worked. So we can see now we have our search component, and our calculate component has been hidden. So let's see now if we search for a cryptocurrency and we select that. Now you can see that our search component has been hidden, and now we have our calculate component. Okay, so that's all good. So the next thing that we can do now is we can actually start to build out our calculate component. And that's going to be another form pretty similar to search. So we can actually probably copy over some of our logic for that. So let's jump back over here, and I'm just going to really quickly clean this up a little bit. Let's get rid of that debugger. We can get rid of this console log over here, and I think that we are not using this name value, so we can just get rid of that. But let's jump over into our calculate component. We can see we haven't really done anything with this yet. I think that we are basically going to do a lot of what we did with search though. So if we look at this, we want to have probably another header. We're going to be creating a form. We're going to do kind of the same thing here. So let's go ahead and just copy this over into calculate. And we really just need to tweak this just a little bit. So let's just get rid of the list because we aren't going to have that anymore. We're going to change this H1. So at this point, basically, the user will have selected a cryptocurrency. So what we want to do here is we basically want to say, how much of X do you own? And we'll fill this part in a second. I'm just going to put a little placeholder in there. So for our label, I think we just want to say basically enter amount owned. And then let's change our placeholder. So we're going to make this say, how much do you own? And then for the value, we'll set this to this.props.amount. We'll keep that class name as field. I think the only additional thing we want to add to this form is we need to have a submit button. So I'm going to create another div. And again, we can just give this class name of form group. And then inside of this, let's create a new input. And we'll give it a type of submit. And we'll give it a class name. And we'll call this calculate button, and then we'll give it a value of calculate my total. And so I think what we can do now is we can just basically pass down the active currency in our props. So what we can do is say this.props.active currency for this value. And then for our form, we are going to want to have a on submit, and we'll set that equal to a we'll say this.props.handle submit, and we'll create that method in a second. So now let's jump back into our portfolio container, and let's just make sure that we're passing down all the props that we're going to need for our calculate component. So we are going to have a handle change again. So we'll say handle change equals this dot handle change, and we're going to probably need to modify that method in a second. We're also going to have a handle submit, which we need to create. So we'll say handle submit equals this dot handle submit, and I'll add that here so we don't forget. And then we also are passing down the active currency. So we'll say active currency equals this dot props dot active currency. And I think that might be it. Let's see. Handle change, handle submit, active currency. Oh, and we also need to pass down the amount. So let's see. Say amount equals this dot props dot, or sorry, we'll say this dot state dot amount, and this should be state as well. All right, so now we need to set up our handle change and our handle submit for calculate. And I'm going to create a new method and call it handle amount. So underneath this, let's just say handle amount. And for this, all we're going to do is basically just update the amount in our state. So we'll say this dot set state, and we will just keep it nice and vague and do e.target.name, and we'll set that to e.target.value. So all that's going to do is when we change the input field in our calculate form, this method will run and it'll just update our state. It'll basically just set amount in our state to the value being set in the input field. So that takes care of our handle change for calculate. For handle submit now, we're going to want to do something kind of similar to what we did for our handle change up above, where we made a post request to our currencies controller. So actually, let's just copy this over. So in our handle submit, let's do e again as an argument, and we'll just do e.prevent default. And then let's just set up the data that we want to pass through to our controller. So if you remember, if you look back at the controller that we created earlier, we basically said that we want to pass in the ID of the currency and the amount that the user owns to basically set up all of our calculations. So we jump back over here. What we can do is we can say, let's see, like let currency equal this dot state dot active currency, and we'll say let amount equal this dot state dot amount. And then what we can do is we can set up a post request. But instead of hitting search, now we want to hit calculate. And for the data that we're going to pass through, we are going to send an ID, and we'll just pass in the currency's ID. And we want to send an amount, and we'll just pass in amount. Okay, so now basically we'll make a post request to calculate. That will hit our controller, and then we'll get some data back from that. And what we can do now is in our dot then, we can update our state again. But what we want to do now is we want to update our portfolio. And what we can do is we can use the spread operator and do this dot state dot portfolio. And then we can do, I think from data, we'll get back data. And that'll just add the next item into our portfolio array. So along with that, we also basically want to empty out amount in our state, so we can just make that into an empty string again. And for active currency, I think we want to make that basically null again, which will bring us back to our search form. So let's go ahead and underneath this, I'm just going to console log our state, and we will see if this works basically. Okay, so before we try that, let me just make sure everything looks good. For our handle amount, we need to actually pass in e as an argument there, because we're using that here. And for our handle amount and handle submit methods, we actually need to bind these up here. So let's do that. And we'll do this dot handle amount equals this dot handle amount dot bind this. So that should be good for our new methods. And those I think look all good. So we're passing down handle change, handle submit, active currency, and amount into our calculate component. If we jump over here and look, so we're doing props.amount here. We've got our handle change here. We actually need to change the name of this. So we copied this over from our search form, but this input field is going to be called amount inside of our calculate component. And then in our active currency here, we're actually just trying to pass down the name. So we'll basically say how much of XYZ name of a cryptocurrency do you own. So I think we should be all good. You know what, actually let's not console log state here. Let's get rid of that. And what I actually want to do is let's console log the data that we get back from the server up here to see if we're getting the correct response from our controller. So if everything works, we should hit our .then after the post request, and we should console log out the data that we're getting back from the server. So let's try this out in our browser. So again, I'm going to search for Bitcoin. We'll select that. We're getting a little error over here. I guess I misspelled class name somewhere, but nothing major. So now let's try to say enter amount owned. I'm going to say 5. And now let's do calculate my total. And it looks like that worked. So you can see that that actually cleared out the values for amount and for the active currency in our state, which made it switch back to our search form. And if we look at what's been logged to the console, we can see we have data, and inside of that, it looks like we have all of our data from that calculate method in our controller. So we have the amount, we have the currency item in question, we have the current price, and we have the value based off the current price and the amount that we own. So now really quickly, let's just do a quick recap on what we have so far. So right here we have our search component, and what we can do with this now is we can search for a cryptocurrency. I keep using Bitcoin as the example, but we could also easily look for, Ethereum. We could look for, like maybe Zcash. So basically, we can search for a cryptocurrency, and now you can see once we select that now, this will switch into our calculate component, and this will ask us how much of that do we own. So let's say that I own 50 Zcash. So now when I click calculate my total, we can see that that cleared out the active currency. So we can see that switches back to the search component. And what we can see over here is that we now get a response from our server. And in that we have the data with the basically everything we need to add this to our portfolio. So we have the amount, we have the currency we selected, we have the current price, and we have the value. So now with that, I think we're ready to build out our portfolio component. So let's jump back over into our code. And let's take a look now at our portfolio component. So we haven't actually added anything to this yet. So let's
start building this out. So I'm going to again import React and component from React. And let's go ahead and create our class. I'm going to say class portfolio extends component. And we'll add a constructor, and we'll pass in props. And then we'll do super with props. And then we'll add a render and return.
And so this is basically going to be our portfolio. And within this, we're going to have actually, I think, portfolio items. So let's actually create a portfolio item component as well. So we do portfolio item. And then let's just copy over what we just did here. And I'll just rename this to portfolio item. And then we can do export default portfolio item. And similarly, we can do export default for portfolio. So in here, let's create a new div. And the way that I'm thinking about the portfolio is basically two separate things. So you'll have a list of all the portfolio items. So that'll be one piece of it. The other piece of it will be just the actual total value of the portfolio. So let's create those two items. So let's have up above, we're going to have a div. We'll give it a class name of, let's say, portfolio value. So this is going to be where we focus on the total value of the portfolio. And then the second section we're going to create is going to be, we'll give it a class name of, let's say, like portfolio items. So in portfolio value, we are going to have, let's say, another div. And this will basically be our header. So we'll say class name equals portfolio value like header. And then I also want to create the actual content. So in our header, we're basically going to say, your total portfolio value is, and then inside of the content piece, we'll actually put in the total, which we need to set. So we'll do that in a second. So now inside of portfolio items, what we want to do here is in the portfolio item component, we need to create a general structure for the portfolio item. And then what we'll do is for all the portfolio items that get added to the portfolio, we'll render them in here. So let's actually go ahead and let's jump into portfolio item. And let's just build out the basic structure that we want to have in here. So now in portfolio item, we're just going to have some very simple HTML. Basically, we just have a parent div, and then we have a row, and then we have a column, and that's kind of the structure. So we have 4 columns, and each column has a header, and then the text. And what we're going to do is pass in props, and we're going to do this.props.item.currency.name, this.props.item.currentPrice, this.props.item.amount owned. So we're going to be passing in all those values that we're going to get back from the server. So that's all that we need to do for portfolio item. And we've exported that out. So what we can do now is we can actually import that into our portfolio component. So we can do import portfolio item from portfolio item. And now that we're importing that, what we can do is we can create the list of portfolio items to add into our portfolio. So down here, I'm going to create, we'll say const portfolio items. And we're going to do something similar to what we did with the list of currencies earlier. So basically what we'll be doing is if you go back to our portfolio container, so basically just to recap, after we make the post request to calculate, we're going to update state. And for portfolio, we'll just keep adding new items to the array. So this is basically going to be an array of portfolio items. So what we'll end up doing with that is, and we can actually just, at this point, let's import portfolio in here. And what we can do is we can add our portfolio component down here after we do the search or calculate. So do portfolio. And what we want to do in here is we want to pass in portfolio. And we'll just set that equal to this.state.portfolio. So now basically we just passed down portfolio from our portfolio container. So in our props, we now have this.props.portfolio. What we can do is, again, we can use map. So we'll do map, and we'll basically say we want to get the item, and we want to pass in the index as well. So now for each item in our portfolio array, we want to use our portfolio item component. And in that, we're just going to pass in a key and set that equal to the index. And then we're going to pass in, we'll call it item, and we'll set that equal to the item. So this should basically handle creating the list of portfolio items for our portfolio. So the other thing that we want to do is we want to set the total here. So we're trying to get the total value of the portfolio. So again, we have access to this.props.portfolio. So what we can do is, for our total, we can do this.props.portfolio. And we can actually use reduce here. So we can do dot reduce, and we'll set total and current. And all we need to do now is basically do total plus current value, and set the default starting point to 0. And so now with that, we can actually plug in this value for our total. And I think that might be everything that we need to do for our portfolio component. So let's take a look back at our portfolio container really quick. So we can see that we are passing in our search component and our calculate component with this search or calculate value. And then now additionally, we're passing in our portfolio component. And then we're passing down our portfolio value from our state, which we now have access to in our portfolio component as our props. And what we're doing with that is basically we're mapping all of our portfolio items to create a list down here. And then we are setting the total based off all of the data in our portfolio. So if everything is working, we should have everything we need now to basically build out our portfolio. So let's take a look and see if this is working. So if we look now, we can see we've got our search component here. Now we can actually see we have our portfolio component down below this. So you can see this header of your total portfolio value, and currently it's at 0. So what we can do now is, let's say we want to look for Bitcoin. So I'll select that. Let's say that I own 10. And now when we calculate my total, we can see that our portfolio is updated. Now we have a total value. And we have this list of basically those columns that we created in our portfolio item component. So this is one portfolio item here now. So we have the currency, which is Bitcoin. We have the current price, which is the current price. We have the amount that we own in our portfolio. And it looks like for some reason we're not getting that value. Let's take a quick look at why that value is not showing up for the amount really quick. So let's see. In our portfolio item, we set this.props.item.currency.name. We've got current price. This should just be amount. So let's fix that. Let's come back over here. So let's try that again. So Bitcoin, we'll say we own 10. We'll calculate that. And now we can see total portfolio value is updated, and we have the currency, Bitcoin, current price, amount of the portfolio. We now see 10, and then we have the current value of this portfolio item. So additionally, we can add Ethereum, and we can say, let's say we have 25 of that. You can see now we're adding additional portfolio items to our portfolio. So it's a little bit messy right now because there's no styling, but you can see we actually have kind of all of the logic here now. So now let's actually add a little styling to this and try to clean this up a little bit. So back in our app, inside of our portfolio container, so down here we have our basic logic. So what I want to do is on our topmost div, I'm just going to wrap this with a class name, and I'm going to make that grid. And then the main thing that I want to do here is for our search and calculate forms, I'm going to give that a class name of left. And then for our portfolio, I'm just going to wrap this with another div and give that a class name of right. And what we can do is we can break this apart into kind of a 2-column layout. That'll make it a little bit easier to read, I guess. And so with that now, I'm just going to paste a little bit of CSS that I've put together into this in our application CSS file. And let's come back over here now and let's just refresh the page. So it's the exact same content. We've just modified this with a little bit of CSS. And basically all we've done is broken out the content so that our search and calculate functionality is on the left, and now our portfolio is on the right. So now we can test this out. So let's say we search again for Bitcoin. We can see we have our auto search populating below this. So I'll select Bitcoin. That's going to switch over to our calculate component now. And for that, I can say we own 15, and I can select calculate my total. And so let's break down what just happened. So basically we calculated our total, that added the item into our portfolio, and that added a new portfolio item that updated our portfolio's total value, and then we cleared out the active item and switched this back to our search component. So now our portfolio has an item in it. We can then search for another cryptocurrency. So we can select Ethereum, and I can say I have 25 Ether. We can calculate that. And again, that's going to empty out the active item, switch from the calculate component back to the search component. And then on the portfolio side of things, we've now added a second item into our portfolio in our state. And now we're rendering out our portfolio items inside of our portfolio over here. So if you want to think about the structure of this in terms of the components that we just created, basically this entire page is our app component, and it's basically also our portfolio container component. And then over here on the left side, we have our search component and we have our calculate component. And then over here on the right side, we have our portfolio component. And inside of this, for each portfolio item we add, we have a portfolio item component.